Facebook is there testifying as a bit of a stand-in for an entire industry, and some of the questions being raised are certainly not specific to them, and the auxiliary companies that are doing things with this data, certainly Cambridge Analytica is not the only example of that either. So this, it's important for people to understand that this problem is sort of completely pervasive.
So what does that mean for the next generation of coders, innovators, entrepreneurs, startups?
Well, that's a great question. So there's maybe two things I would say there. One is, you went right to one of the points that I like to make, which is the previous generation of engineers simply weren't really trained to consider these issues, right? These kind of ethical issues. It wasn't really typically part of the curriculum, and now that's starting to change, especially here, for example, at the Information School at the University of Washington and many other places. We're starting to change that. So there's some sense the next generation will be better equipped to discuss these issues and build in ethical considerations and privacy protections as part of the design of the systems they're building, as opposed to kind of an afterthought that they have to correct for. The second point I make, though, you mentioned startups. One of the points that Mark Zuckerberg made today, even I think at the testimony, is that regulations do disproportionately affect startups, and there is some truth to that, right? I mean, it's very expensive to be compliant with strong new laws, and the big companies are equipped to pay that price. Smaller companies are not, and so you want to be a little bit sensitive to the chilling effect that some of these things could have on innovation. Right, so there's a pretty exorbitant cost to comply with some of the laws being proposed, but just in general regulation. And large companies are equipped to sort of pay that cost, and in fact they're the ones that the regulation is targeting, because they, when you have X number of billion users, you have a very serious impact. But a startup that's just getting off the ground, having to enforce these regulations from day one, there's a disproportionate effect there. They can't always afford to go after certain kinds of business models, to even explore certain kinds of business models with these regulations in place. And that's what we end up trying to teach, is that it needs to be a first-class design consideration with anything you build in this space, as opposed to let's make sure that our algorithms perform very well and have a super high accuracy, and then as an afterthought consider what these might be used for. That needs to be sort of brought up in the discussion in the first place. And that is the way programs are starting to evolve to teach students, but it wasn't that way for the previous generation, which I think is one way to explain some of the effects you're seeing.
That we're seeing them learn on the fly and make mistakes in front of everyone.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things going on here. They are making mistakes, and they are doing it in front of everyone. But there's a fundamental tension between the business model of offering free online services, and users' demand for manageable privacy, right? I mean, that's kind of right at the heart of the entire reason they exist. So they exist to make data available to advertisers, to help advertisers sell products to you better. There's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, but how that's managed and who has control over what, and how you were able to prevent things like what happened with Cambridge Analytica, that is relatively new territory. And so you've seen Facebook in particular, but other ones make some pretty serious missteps along the way. I mentioned as a first-class design consideration, these issues need to be considered. I think that one thing I guess I like to mention is that there's a temptation to say that, well, there's technology issues here, and then there's these sort of social and ethical issues here, and that the engineer's responsibility is to focus on the technology, and then perhaps there's other employees that'll focus on this. And I don't really buy into that. I really think that not only is it the engineer's responsibility to do so, but also there are technical problems to actually explore here, right? There's a technical interpretation of how to manage privacy that is right in the wheelhouse of the kind of training that the engineers are getting. And so sort of trying to break that sort of false dichotomy of one type of person does the technology, another type of person manages the ethics, is something that we've been pretty serious about at the Information School.
Is there anything else I'm forgetting?
Well, it sounds like we're not talking too much about this specific breach, but one thing I guess I like to mention is that, Facebook's policies were sort of demonstrably bad in some ways, and they've incrementally changed them over the years. But in some sense, they were following their policies in various ways. The really only seriously unethical thing that happened here was that somebody said that for academic research, I'm going to collect this data, and then used it for something that was absolutely not academic research. And so that duplicity is really kind of the source of the uproar about this. And so that's one way to contrast this with other kinds of data breaches that happen. I think that's why people are really reacting to this so strongly.
There's that initial lie from Cambridge. There's the fact that Facebook knew about it from a vendor and didn't do anything about it for a couple of years until they were found There are some layers.
Facebook is far from blameless in any of this. I mean, right, so they had bad policies to begin with that have since been changed, but again, they were bad policies for years, and specifically, you know, the reason why there were so many people involved that swept up in this is the fact that if I give you permission for my data, you automatically had access to my friend's data as well. That's a bad policy, and they changed that. But then also, as you mentioned, you know, they didn't react appropriately when this happened, right? They tried to keep it quiet. They you know, asked politely for the data to be deleted and didn't really follow up and so on. So a lot of missteps there. But again, that real unethical step in my mind was, you know, when I asked you, hey, will you give me access to your data? People are usually willing to say, for research purposes, I'm fine with that. And so go around and sell that to another company for political purposes, you wouldn't have gotten the same people opting in for that process had they known that's what was going on. And so that I think is specifically about this breach, but also what can companies do to prevent that kind of bait and switch tactics from working so well, I think is something that Facebook and other companies need to explore.